Unfortunately, the bad news did not begin with Bray this week. It started 24 hours earlier. When I was on my way home from a funeral when I heard the news that Terry Funk had passed away at the age of 79. And I know he hadn't been in the best of health for a while. Don Morocco is the one who let it slip a couple of years ago on his podcast that Terry was dealing with dementia and was staying in an assisted living facility. And things had gotten worse since his wife Vicky passed away. He met Vicky when they were both in the 6th grade. So, I mean, they had been together for so long, and she died in 2019. But I mentioned SmackDown in the Bray Wyatt tributes last night. They also paid tribute to Terry Funk. And they flew Cody into the show, even though Cody is part of Raw. Cody Rhodes was on SmackDown this week and had a nice little promo in the ring talking about one of his father's greatest rivals, the one who used to call Dusty Rhodes an egg-sucking dog. That would be Terry Funk. And then they had what they called the Terry Funk Hardcore match in his honor, which was supposed to be a hardcore match between the Street Profits and the Brawling Brutes. And I'm still wondering what exactly was so hardcore about that match, because we had one table in the match that came into play for the finish. Otherwise, it was basically just a regular match. So not much of a hardcore match. But Terry Funk, he was middle-aged and crazy. That's what he called himself. The oldest 50-year-old that I have ever seen. When Terry Funk was 50, he looked like he was 70, but he wrestled like he was 30. The things that he would do in that ring. I remember he did a springboard moonsault off the ropes to the floor once. Onto Mark Henry. I think it was on an episode of Raw. And here's Mark Henry. Even though he's still new to the business at that point, he was probably 2 years into the business, if that, at that point. But here's Mark Henry, the world's strongest man, and he just didn't catch him at all. And Terry smacked the metal guardrail. He was out of his mind. But that was Terry Funk. He didn't start doing moonsaults until he was in his 50s. It's like watching Sting in his 60s doing balcony dives in AEW. They don't have to do it, but they want to. It's like they're trying to prove themselves when they have absolutely nothing to prove. Terry Funk had nothing to prove. He had already had himself a Hall of Fame career even before he started doing all of that stuff. I only wish he had more than 2.5 minutes to actually talk about that career when WWE inducted him and his brother together into the Hall of Fame in 2009. They were inducted as a pair. And that's how long Terry was given to speak. 2.5 minutes. Imagine giving Terry Funk 2 minutes to sum up an entire career. A career that spans 6 decades. This is a man who wrestled Lou Thesz and teamed with Bruno Sammartino, and also wrestled CM Punk and Homicide. This is a man who worked with the legends of this industry. Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, Hulk Hogan, Andre the Giant, Harley Race, Ricky Steamboat, Jerry Lawler. So many big names in territories and promotions all over the world. First, he was teaming with his brother Dory Jr. They won multiple tag team titles together. And then he branched out on his own. He beat Jack Briscoe to become NWA World Heavyweight Champion. Right? That was a title he held for over 400 days. And he gave it up to win back his wife. His wife had divorced him because of all the time that he was spending as champion on the road. He was the traveling champion. He gave it up. And they remarried, and they stayed married ever since, over 40 years, until her death. But that's not the Terry Funk that I grew up with. That was just before my time. The Terry Funk that I remember was during the mid-'80s expansion that WWF was going through when they brought him in and he was tagging with Dory. Dory at the time was called Hoss. He was Hoss Funk. And they had Jimmy Jack Funk, the fake Funk brother. Kind of like the fake Von Erich. But I remember him and Dory, they teamed up at the second WrestleMania. Terry actually worked 2 WrestleManias in his entire career, both of them in tag team matches, and both times he came out a winner. The second time was WrestleMania 14 with Cactus Jack when they beat the New Age Outlaws in a dumpster match. He did wrestle Hogan on at least one Saturday night's main event that I remember, but in '86, he left to go work in Puerto Rico and Japan. And who knows how much more, he would have worked with Hogan at that point. I don't know that he would have ended up having some sort of extended program with Hogan. It was just an era where, Vince McMahon was bringing in people or using people that were physically as big or bigger than Hogan, so that Hogan could go in there and almost be like the giant killer. He was wrestling Andre, he was wrestling King Kong Bundy, he was wrestling Big John Studd. Later on, it was the Big Boss Man, and it was always the Undertaker. It was always these big guys that they loved putting Hogan in the ring with. There were some exceptions. People like Randy Savage and Roddy Piper were not physically imposing people, like Hogan would normally be in the ring with. But, Terry Funk was a man of average size compared to the people Hogan was working with. So I don't know if Terry would have ended up having like a pay-per-view match with him or anything. If he would have stuck around, would it have been Hogan and Funk in a cage at WrestleMania 2 instead of Hogan and Bundy? That I don't know. But he decided to leave. And like I said, he went to Puerto Rico and he went to Japan. His program with Ric Flair in WCW in 1989 is legendary. And for Flair, how can you say that 89 wasn't the absolute peak of Ric Flair? Between the trilogy that he and Ricky Steamboat had, and then the matches that he had with Terry Funk. First, their Great American Bash match, which Terry wrestled with a broken tailbone. That Great American Bash show in 89 is one of the all-time great pay-per-views. Just for the last, 3 or 4 matches on the card alone. I don't remember the undercard being anything special, but for the 3 or 4 key matches on that show, it's one of the greatest pay-per-views of all time. You had Sting against Muta. You had Luger against Steamboat. They had a War Games match. I don't remember everybody who was in it, but they had a War Games match. And they had Terry Funk and Ric Flair. All 4-star matches and above. Their Great American Bash match, it led to their even better I Quit match at the Clash of the Champions. New York Knockout. I think of Terry Funk's run with ECW. He was a 2-time ECW World Champion, and without Terry Funk, it is very likely that ECW does not reach the heights that it did. Paul Heyman in the Beyond the Mat documentary, and that scene right before their very first pay-per-view. He's giving the locker room a big pep talk backstage. Everybody's sitting around and standing around listening to Paul E., and he flat out says, "We would not be here were it not for that man over there, were it not for Terry Funk," who went out and won 2 matches that night and won their world title, which gave it that much more credibility, because Terry Funk held it. What else do I think of when I think of Terry Funk? I think of the empty arena match that he and Jerry Lawler had at the Mid-South Coliseum in 1982. And Terry writhing around at the end of it, grabbing his bloody eye, screaming, "My eye, my eye!" Right? That's an iconic match. I think of Survivor Series 1993. It was supposed to be Bret Hart and his brothers against Jerry Lawler and his Knights, until Lawler got into some legal problems and he was replaced by Shawn Michaels. So it was Shawn Michaels and the Knights, which didn't make as much sense. But they looked like they were straight out of medieval times. You had the Red Knight, you had the Blue Knight, you had the Black Knight. The Blue Knight was clearly Greg the Hammer Valentine under a mask. The Red Knight was played by Barry Horowitz. But that role was not originally intended for Barry Horowitz. The role was intended for Terry Funk. That's according to Bruce Pritchard and to Terry himself in his book. So from wrestling Jerry Lawler in an empty arena at the Mid-South Coliseum to being one of his Royal Knights. That was the idea. Terry claimed they called him about becoming head booker for the company because Pat Patterson was looking to, I guess, reduce his workload. So their plan was he would come in, work the match, he would lose to Bret Hart during the match, and so after he's eliminated, Bret would pull the mask off and reveal Terry Funk. And then after that show, he would transition into his new role as the head of creative. In his book, Terry claimed that he had a very nice dinner after he flew into New York, very nice dinner with Pat Patterson. He went back to his hotel, and he just decided, you know what? I don't want to move to New York after all. All the hustle and bustle, and I don't want to be here. I don't want to do this. So he bailed on the gig. But according to Pritchard, it was after Patterson made the suggestion that the Knights would be unmasked after each one of them were eliminated. That's when Terry, all of a sudden, he bowed out. So that's his version of it. But Terry left a note on the door to Vince McMahon's hotel room the day of the show that read, "My horse is sick. I think he's dying. I'll see you later." Just stuck it on the door. I got a sick horse at home. I got to fly back. He said he was at the airport when he heard them calling his name over the paging system. They were probably trying to get a hold of him. And he started running to his gate. I'm trying to picture Terry Funk running. Even back then, I can't do it. But he started running to his gate. He managed to get away. He got on the flight and he went home. Years later, when Terry came back to work for WWE, one of the first things Vince McMahon said to him was, "So how's your horse?" I always loved that story. But yeah, we came very close to having a Terry Funk cameo at Survivor Series 93. I think of Hardcore Heaven the following year, when ECW wasn't even called Extreme yet. They were still Eastern Championship Wrestling. He and Cactus Jack, there's a famous ECW moment. They summoned the fans to throw chairs into the ring so they could fend off Public Enemy. And the fans obliged, but they didn't just throw chairs at them. They almost buried them in chairs. Chairs came flying into the ring. And they actually did bury poor Rocco Rock and Johnny Grunge. They got buried underneath all the chairs. And you had the ring announcer, I don't remember if it was Steven DeAngelis or not, but they had the ring announcer just begging the crowd, please do not throw chairs into the ring. Terry wanted chairs. He got his chairs. You want something? You got to be ready when they give it to you. When I think of him in ECW, you know what I also think of? I think of him being tangled in a ball of barbed wire with Sabu and almost dying. And Sabu also, I think that was the match where he tore his bicep or something, and he told Fonzie to go get tape, and he literally taped his arm back up. So Sabu, he had some issues in the match himself, but poor Terry Funk, he and Sabu are trapped in this just ball of barbed wire that they had to cut them out of when the match was over. And Terry almost died because the barbed wire ended up getting wrapped around his neck. So they had to be very careful with that. I think of his many retirements, his many retirements, and alleged retirements. One of them came in 1997. He and his brother Dory, they hosted their own show with a little bit of assistance from Paul Heyman and ECW, which sent a lot of talent in for the show. And they had Joey Styles doing commentary for it. A show called 50 Years of Funk, because it was 50 years since their father moved the family to Amarillo, Texas, after the Second World War ended. But it was also billed as Terry Funk's final match, which was a running joke in wrestling. Nobody has had more retirements than Terry Funk. But this time he really meant it, or at least that's what he said. Dory Funk wrestled Rob Van Dam on the show. That's like one of those Be the Booker matches that I like randomly book at the end of a YouTube stream. Dory Funk Jr. against Rob Van Dam, but it actually happened back in 1997. Mankind wrestled Sabu, and in the main event that night, Vince McMahon allowed Bret Hart, who at the time was his champion, he was the WWF champion, to wrestle Terry Funk. Now, if you saw Beyond the Mat, you know that Dennis Stamp wasn't booked for the show originally, and he was very upset about this. To the point where Terry had to go to his home with the cameras for the documentary to beg him to be part of his retirement match, and to beg him to be the special referee. And that scene of Dennis Stamp bouncing on the trampoline at his home, that will forever be etched in my mind. Dennis Stamp was actually Bret Hart's very first opponent. Dennis Stamp was supposed to wrestle somebody, they no-showed, and so 16-year-old Bret Hart got the spot instead. So there was a little tie-in with him and Bret as well. But these two men, Bret Hart and Terry Funk, they went toe-to-toe for 25 minutes. They had a hell of a match. If you've never seen it before, you can find it online. It's actually a hell of a match. Bret, in his book, said that he had a really bad flu, and he was sick as a dog that day, but he peeled himself out of bed. He wasn't going to miss this match for anything. He even wanted to put Terry over, which would have been a big deal given the fact that Bret was the champion at the time. For Vince McMahon to allow his champion to be pinned, even if it was for a special occasion, that just shows you the respect that they had for Terry Funk. But Terry said no. He insisted that he be the one to do the job for Bret. And the fans in the building did not like that finish. Terry used the back suplex. Both men's shoulders were down. At the very last second, Bret got his shoulder up, and so he won the match. But that's what Terry wanted. He wanted to go out doing the honors. Right? At least that was the idea. His retirement lasted all of 11 days before he was back in the ring in Japan working for FMW. And FMW was another promotion, like ECW, that does not have the success that it did without Terry Funk working there. You know, he was part of that big Japanese deathmatch boom, and I do mean boom, because one of the more famous matches of his career, and I know I'm jumping around time-wise here, was his exploding barbed wire death match. I think they called it a time bomb match or something. But basically, it was an exploding barbed wire death match. Terry Funk against Atsushi Onita in 1993. The finish of that match is what inspired the exploding barbed wire death match at AEW Revolution 2 years ago with Kenny Omega and Jon Moxley. Only the finish in that one did not go as planned. That, as we all remember, the finish did not exactly go the way they had hoped. They tried. Had Eddie Kingston, he was protecting Moxley from the devastating post-match sparkler explosion over there in Daly's place. Reminded me of that scene from Die Hard with a Vengeance, where Simon Gruber, he plants a bomb in a school, and they're trying to disarm it. This guy Charlie, he's trying to disarm it, and it's counting down, and it's looking like it's going to go off, and then finally it counts down to 0, and Charlie gets sprayed with pancake syrup instead. It's like, that's it? No bomb. But the finish of the Onita match, it's this big dramatic thing. The clock is ticking down. He's already made it out of the ring to safety, but he sees Terry. He's laying in the ring. And he's having this crisis of conscience. What should he do? I mean, Onita was always one for the theatrics. So he jumps back in. He's smacking Terry in the face. He's trying to revive him. And then he realizes, because he hears the people counting, he goes, there's not enough time. So he just lays on top of him to shield him from the pending explosion. And it looked a lot better there than it did in AEW. But I think of his Shotgun Saturday Night appearance. You can't see, but I'm smiling right now. This was back in the early days of Shotgun, when the show aired live every Saturday night. And they took the show to these really small clubs and venues. First, it was the old Mirage nightclub here in New York. I think they did 2 Shotguns there. The first one they ever did, though, was at the Mirage nightclub in New York, which got shut down by the DEA years later. And now some of you may know it as Terminal 5, which has played host to many wrestling shows, mainly Ring of Honor shows, although House of Glory did hold a show there last year. It was actually a year ago this month. But the Mirage, Webster Hall, Penn Station, and one of the shows they took on the road to San Antonio, Texas, to a little place called Denim and Diamonds. And Terry Funk made an appearance on that show, because they were in Texas, and they gave Terry Funk a live microphone. Or Todd Pettengill was in the ring and Terry was with him. But they gave Terry Funk a live microphone, and that can be a very dangerous thing. It was on this night he got a ton of heat with The Office for the things that he said, even though he claims he cleared most of it with them beforehand. He called Vince McMahon, who was doing commentary, a Yankee bastard. He called Jim Ross an oaky asshole. He said Todd Pettengill's mother was a whore. So I guess they didn't like that very much. He got heat for it. He even called out Stone Cold Steve Austin, who was... I remember he was sitting next to Vince on commentary. I don't know why, because I know he wrestled later in the show. But I remember when Terry was popping off, it was Vince and Austin, funny enough, who were sitting next to each other doing commentary. And he went off on Stone Cold, and they brawled later in the show. They only did a handful of shows from those special locations. After that, they just taped them in the arenas before Raw. And at that point, I mean, it was never the same. You know, I really like the original concept, but once they basically turned it into main event, it basically just died a death. And then there was the Chainsaw Charlie run. Mick Foley needed some help against the New Age Outlaws, and so he brought in an old friend. That old friend was Terry Funk, but not as himself, but as Chainsaw Charlie. Chainsaw Charlie was the nickname of one of Terry's very good friends, John Ayers, who played in the NFL. He had died of cancer a few years before this, so he paid tribute to him with the name. And there he was, wielding a chainsaw and wearing pantyhose over his head, like we couldn't tell who it was. He almost blew himself up once, by the way. The chain in the chainsaw did not actually move. So they put some kind of device in there. I don't know what it's called, but they put some kind of device in there to make it so that sparks would fly all over the place when he would, supposedly turn it on. And he would hold it over his head, right? It looked like Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, who we just saw on Dynamite a few weeks ago. But one time, some of the gas started leaking out of the chainsaw right on top of his head, and he's very lucky those sparks did not light him up, or else Chainsaw Charlie might have ended up in bits and pieces. The exploding barbed wire death match did not do him in, but fucking Chainsaw Charlie almost did. You can't make this stuff up. And whose idea was it for him to be Chainsaw Charlie? Shall we blame Vince McMahon for this wonderful idea? Nope. This was all Terry Funk. He was going to pop out of this giant wooden crate. Bruce Pritchard asked him, do you want to come out as anything? And he just blurted out, Chainsaw Charlie, get me a chainsaw. He talked about it in his book. He said, I can't explain it. It just popped into my head. They asked me what I wanted to wear and then got me some Levi jeans and a pair of suspenders. I already had a red shirt, so I kept that. Then they got me a woman's pantyhose stocking and some baby powder to put on my head, all at my request. And then he put in parenthesis, one an idiot. I guess I could have just gone out there without anything over my head, but I wouldn't have been Chainsaw Charlie with Terry Funk's head, now would I? I would have been Chainsaw Terry. I came out of that box with my chainsaw and my stocking over my head, and the crowd, expecting some great surprise, let out a sound that seemed strangely reminiscent of escaping gas. And he's right. It went over like a wet fart. He brought the chainsaw back, though, many years later. In 2016, remember, he gave it to Dean Ambrose before his WrestleMania match that year with Brock Lesnar. You know what else stands out to me about that Chainsaw Charlie run? The dumpster angle. The dumpster angle on Raw's War. The New Age Outlaws put Foley and Funk in this giant dumpster on stage, and they tied the lid shut, and then they pushed the dumpster off the side of the stage. That was a memorable angle. I remember Jim Ross absolutely freaking out on commentary, and all the wrestlers came out on the side of the stage as the medics were checking on them to try to help, and they really played it up like a serious injury angle. And I thought it was really well done. I thought it was a well-done way to get heat on Road Dogg and Billy Gunn. And then they had to go and turn it into a cartoon at the end of the show by having them come back to the building. They were hooked up to their IV poles from the hospital, still in their hospital gowns. And I know some people probably liked that. I hated that part. I thought it ruined the whole angle. But I still remember it vividly. I remember watching it that night. Terry Funk was just so good at everything. Even his involvement in the Hell in a Cell match between The Undertaker and Mankind. Funk and Foley, they were feuding. They were enemies at the time. They were not on the same page. But Terry broke kayfabe. He came out. He was checking on Mick after he took that first bump off the top of the cell. And then after the second bump into the ring, he was trying to buy time for Mick to just try to recover a little bit and let the medics and the trainers check on him. So he had Undertaker attack him and give him a chokeslam. And he got chokeslam right out of his sneakers. And Mick has talked about this. He was on Dream Street. He didn't know where he was. So when he sort of came to, he was on the mat and he's staring down at this pair of sneakers that had no feet in them. And he's wondering, whose shoes are these? He didn't even know they were Terry's. But then again, when the match was over, he didn't even know if they used the thumbtacks. Which is pretty scary. That there were big chunks of the match like that. He had thumbtacks sticking out of every fucking orifice in his body. He's like, oh, did we get to the tacks? Did we get to use the tacks? Mick, yeah, you might want to look down. That's scary. But he spent some time in WCW after that. He won the US title, won the hardcore title. That was actually his second U.S. title. His first one came in 1975. 25 years between U.S. title run. And actually, as I sit here right now, I should have looked it up. I wonder if that's a record. I wonder if that is the longest stretch of time between U.S. title runs. 25 years between runs. There was the second One Night Stand pay-per-view where he tagged with Tommy Dreamer and Beulah against Mick Foley, Edge, and Lita. I just, there's so many Terry Funk moments and memories and promos. And look, he appeared in movies too, right? He had a few movies with Sylvester Stallone that he did. He became very good friends with him. Did stunt work for him. It was Terry Funk who connected Stallone with Hulk Hogan for the part of Thunder Lips in Rocky III. Stallone called him up and said, "Hey, I need a wrestler for the part." And Hogan was one of the names that he recommended. He also recommended Kerry Von Erich for the part of Ivan Drago in Rocky IV. But Kerry couldn't memorize his lines. Nikita Koloff read for that part too. He said the same thing about Kerry. And I'm trying to picture Kerry Von Erich as Drago in Rocky IV, and I can't do it. I just can't do it. Kerry Von Erich as Ivan Drago. I cannot even imagine that. But Stallone paid tribute to Terry on social media this week. He called him a great wrestler, a witty man, and tough as leather. He was one of a kind. And indeed he was. To me, Terry Funk is one of the greatest to ever do it. Whether he's on your Mount Rushmore, I think has a lot to do with what era you may have known him best from. Some people grew up knowing him as the NWA champion and a tag team champion with his brother. Some people grew up as a fan during the period where he wrestled Ric Flair and Ricky Steamboat. Some people may only know him from his 50 and above days, or from his deathmatch days, or God forbid, only from the Chainsaw Charlie days. WWE is the last surviving territory, and I know it's weird to say it that way because of how just gigantic this company is now, publicly traded, billions of dollars, but they are. They're the last surviving territory. They own most of the old footage. They get to narrate history the way that they want to. Terry Funk was never a key figure in WWE history. He was in WCW, at least briefly. He definitely was in ECW. Not so much in WWE. He was never a top star in that company. I do think that affects his standing in the eyes of a lot of people. If he would have gotten a really big run, if he would have gotten that run with Hogan on top, and stuck around for a little bit longer in WWE, I think there would be more people who would include the name Terry Funk in the conversation when they list off who they think are the greatest of all time. Because there are a lot of people who don't name Terry Funk, they don't think of Terry Funk, or they have him further down the list. And it's not because he doesn't deserve to be higher up on the list, it's just that he never had that one big run in one place that would have, I think, cemented him the way that Hogan did and Flair did and other stars that came later on. Terry never really had that. He went to different places. He was very successful. He had a lot of classic matches. But I think it's almost like he falls into this weird donut hole, sort of. I respect Terry Funk. I admire him for a lot of reasons. Beyond just being a great performer, he seemed like a genuinely nice, kind, decent human being. Someone that you wanted to be around. Someone who was fun to be around. He was a credit to the wrestling business. When other legends like Hulk Hogan and like Ric Flair got older and said things and did things that disgraced themselves, Terry Funk was someone who aged gracefully. It's not like the mask slipped and he showed us who he really was. Terry Funk was the same man he always was. He never changed. At the end of Forever Hardcore, that was that independent ECW documentary, not the one that WWE did, came out many years ago. There's a scene at the very end and I like that documentary. It's hurt by the fact that they don't have access to the footage like WWE does when they do their documentaries. They're actually showing you the moments. This was just a straight documentary interviewing a whole bunch of people who were affiliated with ECW, but Terry Funk is one of the people interviewed. And there's this scene at the very end with him where he gets emotional. And he says he could have been a millionaire had he chosen to do the things that he should have done, as opposed to the things that he wanted to do. And that's the other thing I respect the most about Terry Funk. He did things the way that he wanted to do them. Even if it wasn't always the popular choice or the choice that was going to make him the most money, he did it his way. And I will leave you with this quote from his book, which I think sums up Terry Funk in the best possible way. "When I grew up, I was fortunate enough to live the wrestler's life, a life that gave me stories to tell, just like the ones I had heard as a boy. Pirates, millionaires, kings, and adventurers have nothing on me. I would trade my life with no one." A life well lived.